Welcome to session 23 of our class on Biblical Worldview 1. We're in chapter 10, which is the last chapter of the textbook that we're supposed to cover. However, there will be a few more videos covering alternate worldviews. Chapter 10 is entitled Interlude, the time between the Testaments. And this is basically the 400 or so years of silence that God did not speak. At least there's nothing recorded. And all the evidence that we have from the writings that occurred during that time has to do with stating that there was no prophecy, no revelation. But this period of time is certainly not a time when God is not working. His providence is still working through this time period. I'm sure we just simply don't have God telling us what He is doing. Now, there's a lot that goes on during this time period that affects the beginning books of the New Testament, and there's a lot of groundwork laid in order for the Christ to come at the proper time. In slide number 2 of the PowerPoint, you have the time lapse between the final prophecy of Malachi and the birth of Jesus is about 430 years. The empires that are involved in slide number 3, I just want to add a note to this, that the passage that I was referring to a while ago. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I should have had this up already. Well, it's not coming up, but basically the passage says that Jesus came at the proper time when all things were ready for Him to appear. Let me do one more search. Well, I'm not finding it. So, basically what I wanted to add to this slide is slide number 3, is the idea of the Persians. Now, we saw the Persians back in the last chapter that we studied, and basically what I'm trying to get to here is the things that were done in order to get everything ready for Christ to come into the world. And that is, the Persians had the idea of, or they had the practice of within their culture, that whatever a king said, whatever he put into place, what he did could not change. Okay? Now we see this in the book of Esther, where the decree that has gone out to kill all the Jews, that decree could not be undone, but a decree could be made and was made to allow the Jews to protect themselves and even take the advantage to, I think, attack first those who were going to attack them. And so the idea of an unchanging law is basically part of the groundwork. Now, when you come to Alexander the Great, who unites Macedonia and Greece and then conquers the Persian Empire, Alexander, as it says in slide number 3, establishes Greek as the trade language and literary language of the entire region. And what that does is it gives us the language in which the New Testament is going to be written, but it becomes the common language of the man on the street, the everyday person. I think we've talked about the fact that for years people looked at the New Testament in its Greek form, and they didn't know what type of Greek it was. They weren't sure exactly where it had come from, because what they were used to was classical Greek, of Homer and others. But when they found a great many letters and business contracts and such as that, between mothers and fathers, partners in business, whatever, and the personal letters, like I said, being mothers and fathers, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, and so forth. All these letters of the common people, they recognized the Greek in those letters was the same as the Greek of the New Testament. So that was part of the groundwork to bring the Christ into the world. Now, when you come to slide number 4, you have in 164 BC, the Judeans drive out their Seleucid rulers and enjoy a brief time of independence. Now, the Seleucids, basically what happened was when Alexander the Great had conquered the known world, he became depressed and died at a very young age, okay, because he didn't have anything else to conquer. Well, what happened is his empire was divided among, I think he had 4 or 5 generals, okay, and one of those generals was Seleucid, okay. And what happened is he got the portion of Alexander's empire that included Palestine, included Israel. Okay, So that's why we have these Seleucid rulers. Well, the Judeans, there's a group of the Judeans, the Israelites, that rise up under the leadership of the Maccabees, okay, and the name that usually is used is Judas Maccabeus, okay, and he and others were involved in a revolt to try to take back their land and their independence, and that's exactly what they did. But there was a lot of infighting and therefore weak leadership that made them an easy target for the Romans. And the Romans come in slide number 5, and conquer Jerusalem in 63 BC, and in 37 BC, the Roman ruler Herod the Great is installed as king of Judea. There was the emperor in Rome, and then there were lesser rulers under him. And Herod the Great was the first ruler of the region under the Roman Empire. Now, when we talked about the Persians bringing in the idea of an unchangeable law. The Greeks provided the language, and the Romans provided a massive and very well made road system. Okay, roads were made. Stones laid and so forth, and some of these Roman roads can still be seen in different parts of the world. The one that I'm specifically aware of, or at least several that can still be seen, is in the United Kingdom, in London, in Britain and Scotland and Ireland, I'm sure. These Roman roads were so well constructed that they still exist today. How much they're used, I don't know, but they're still in existence. And that speaks volumes for how well they were built. So again, what we have here is the idea of an unchangeable law, the idea of a common language, okay, and then a perfect transportation system. At least it's a whole lot better than it was before, okay. These massive and very well built roads that makes travel very much quicker and easier, and therefore it's easier to spread the gospel once Jesus comes, and the gospel goes after Pentecost, goes beyond Israel, okay, and into the rest of the world. Again, if you remember, I think we've talked about it, the fact that the gospel was supposed to go from Jerusalem to Judea, and then to the north, the northern kingdom, or what was left of the north, in Samaria, and then to the rest of the world. Okay? So the groundwork is being laid very, very well here. And again, while we don't have God telling us exactly how and what he's doing, I think we can say with pretty good confidence that all of this is a part of God's preparation for the Christ to come, and then for the gospel to go forth. Also in slide number 6, we have, during the time of silence, the what is usually called the intertestamental period, that is between the testaments. Okay, the synagogue emerges as one of the central features of Judaism, and rabbis emerge as the central teachers in these local synagogues. Now, there's again, as we said earlier, there's a great deal of development here in this space, in this situation, where the not only does the synagogue take hold, and this is, let me make sure we understand this. This started in the foreign countries where the Israelites had been scattered, and then it made its way to Israel. As you can see in the gospel accounts, Jesus goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he reads and he speaks to the people, and several times he is around people on the Sabbath, and doing things and healing people and so forth. But the synagogue system is an interesting study, and I will point you to a particular book that our authors point you to also here in just a minute. But it was during this time that you had the beginnings of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and probably several other parties within, or groups within Judaism. Okay, this is where Judaism itself comes into being. Okay, because the Judaism of the intertestamental period and the time of Christ and after is not based on the law as much as it's based on what people said about the law. Okay, and there are several different types of material, like the Talmud, the Mishnah, and other things. Okay, that are based. I can't remember the exact usage of each of those terms, but the idea is that one of them, at least, or maybe both of them, is basically commentary on the Old Testament, on the law and the prophets and so forth. But basically on the law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is what they referred to that as. Okay, another term here is Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K or T-A-N-A-C-K. The T stood for Torah, which is law. The N stood for Nevi'im, which is prophets. And the K stood for Ketuvim, which is the writings. And all 3 of those are Hebrew words: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Okay, and you take when you transliterate those, you certainly have a T, an N, and a K, and that becomes 3 basically root letters that they just add vowels to, and when the Jews talk about the whole of what we call the Old Testament, they say the Tanakh. If they just want to talk about the law, the first 5 books, they say Torah or Torah. I don't know exactly how they pronounce it. But it's during this time period, specifically when it has to do with Judaism, that you have all these parties growing up and becoming prominent. And this is the time that you have the council of the 70. I think there's 70 on the council. I could be wrong about that number. But the Jewish council that, Jesus was brought before, Paul was brought before, Peter and others, okay, they're in Jerusalem. And they were, the lawmakers, so to speak. They had the authority to make laws and decide things and condemn people and so forth. So again, it's during this time that all of this emerges and grows. And this is when Jesus comes, this is the type of situation he comes into. Now, in the Sabbath, in the synagogues, again, the synagogues started among the scattered Jews. This is slide number 7. Worship focuses on Torah and Sabbath observance. The high priesthood in Jerusalem becomes a political position. In fact, if you notice in the Gospels, when Jesus goes before the Jews, as far as being tried and interrogated, you notice he goes between Caiaphas and I think it's Annas. Let me make sure again I know of which I speak. Yes. What it was is, in this particular case, I believe it was Annas who was, and you can read about this in the book that I've got here on slide number 7. Annas was the official high priest. Okay, he actually was supposed to be in that office, and he was for a while. But Caiaphas comes along and pays the Romans more money than Annas did, and they remove Annas from the high priesthood and put Caiaphas in. Okay, so it's a very political, very corrupt situation where, as it says in the next statement there, the priesthood is generally corrupt. This is a situation where you could buy the position of the high priesthood, and Caiaphas does so by paying more money. So again, I had to stop and take a call there. So as I was saying, the high priesthood is very, very much an office that can be bought. Okay, and then the synagogue differs from the tabernacle, the temple, and even the church. Okay, because the tabernacle was the tent that was made at Sinai back in Exodus. Okay, and all you read in the latter half of Exodus, you read all those details about the making of the tabernacle. And then the temple was, the tabernacle was used all the way up to the time of David and even the early days of Solomon. And it was when Solomon built the temple that the tabernacle was done away with. And then remember, the temple was destroyed in 586 or 587 by the Babylonians, completely destroyed. And then it was rebuilt in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, okay, but it wasn't rebuilt to the former glory and greatness of Solomon's temple. And then when Herod the Great is put in place by the Romans, he comes along and says, he comes along and adds to the temple and it's huge. It becomes just this colossal, you know, set of buildings around the temple itself, and it's called the Herodian Temple. Okay, and it was not. It took, I think even the Bible references it that it took around 40 years to build, because it was so massive, and the stones that were used in the wall, which you can still see today in the Western Wall in Jerusalem, that portion of the wall that's all that's left of the Herodian Temple, okay, where the Jews today go and they pray at the Western Wall, and they place little pieces of paper with prayers written on them in the cracks between the stones, okay? But, you know, that's kind of a brief history of the temple. But the church is also different than the synagogue. It's based a little bit on the synagogue, in the sense that the synagogue had, each synagogue had elders, okay? And the church is supposed to have elders. And, you know, maybe several other things, okay? But you know, we need to make sure that we distinguish between the synagogue, the tabernacle, the temple, and the church. And then finally on this slide, you should get, if you want to do any in-depth study of this period between the Testaments, okay, and maybe I don't know how far he goes back. He might go back into the Persian period, but he especially covers, you know, the time of silence and everything that goes on there. He discusses in depth, you know, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Zealots, and other parties within the Jewish people. And it's just a wonderful book for this kind of background information. Everett Ferguson, Backgrounds of Early Christianity, 3rd edition. That's the latest edition that is out that I know of. Excellent book. I would urge you to get that. And lastly, what to apply. In slide 8, even though God is silent, he's still active. Okay? As I said, you know, God's not telling us what he's doing, so we can only speculate, okay? But and in many cases, that's not, when we do have text, okay, when we have actual text about what, you know, in the scriptures about what God was doing or not doing, then to speculate there is to go beyond what is said. And I really don't like to speculate about what God did or didn't do in the intertestamental period, okay? But I think there's strong evidence that these things that we've talked about, especially the unchangeableness of the law under the Persians, the language of the Greeks, okay, and it becoming the common language, and then the road system, transportation system, so forth of the the Romans, and how that helped the gospel to go forward quickly, much quicker than it would have without that road system. I think we can be pretty confident in the fact that, or in the idea that God's providence is working in those areas at least, to make the way proper, so that Jesus could come at the proper time, and everything be in place for the spread of the gospel. Okay, like I said, this is the last chapter we cover in this class. You'll get the rest of this book in Biblical Worldview 2. And the next few videos will deal with alternate worldviews, and we will do some comparison between those worldviews and the Christian worldview. All right. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm here to help. Thank you.